Sometimes, a person suddenly feels the inevitability of their own demise, that eerie, icy breath of fate on the back of their neck that makes their heart freeze with fear. In a desperate attempt to avert the fatal sentence, they grasp at any opportunity, changing their lifestyle, seeking medical help, resorting to various means of protection. Some start leading a healthy lifestyle, giving up bad habits, surrounding themselves with amulets and talismans, consulting fortune tellers and psychics. Others withdraw into themselves, avoiding any risks, refusing to travel, or even leave their homes. However, as life shows, even the most meticulous precautions are not always able to outwit the relentless fate. Every step, every decision seems fateful, but paradoxically, it is the excessive caution that sometimes leads to what the person was so diligently trying to avoid. It's not for nothing that folk wisdom has long held the truth: you can't escape your destiny, no matter how hard you try. And perhaps, the wisest decision is to accept your life path with dignity, living each day fully and consciously, regardless of how many are allotted by fate. The heroine of this story was named Terri McAdams, an energetic and vibrant 22-year-old girl from Arkansas. Enjoying immense popularity due to her beauty and cheerful disposition since childhood, Terri, at the time of the events described, lived in Arlington, Texas, USA. Even as a teenager, she could often be seen on the city streets, driving around in a convertible with friends, listening to music loudly. Often, McAdams could be heard before the young beauty appeared in sight. Gladly spending evenings relaxing and having fun with her two younger sisters, Terri adored dancing and took lessons for years, attending classes and various competitions. Attracting a lot of attention, McAdams, however, did not abuse it, remaining a modest and well-mannered girl. A cheerleader who dressed brightly, had a wide circle of friends, and led an active lifestyle, she became a kind of mentor for her sisters Hopper and Pamela, a connecting link between the mother and the younger generation of the family. Although Terri had a warm relationship with all her relatives, she felt a special bond with her younger sisters. The most vivid memory in the girl's life remained a meeting with Princess Diana. This happened when McAdams was traveling in Europe after graduating from high school. During that voyage, she visited Great Britain and accidentally met the famous princess at a dance event. This adventure left an unforgettable impression on Terri. By the way, it was dancing that McAdams devoted a lot of time to, as she took lessons for years, attended classes and competitions. It's no wonder that everyone who knew Terri noted, she simply adored life. Immediately after graduating from high school at an early age, Terri entered the University of Arkansas. However, without waiting for graduation, the girl decided to move to her boyfriend in Arlington, Texas. He was a few years older than her and had already managed to get an education. Wanting to continue her studies, McAdams transferred to an educational institution closer to her beloved, the University of Texas at Arlington, where she became a member of a women's society. Everything was going as well as possible. After graduating from university, Terri intended to get a job, build a career, and also planned to marry her boyfriend, who had already proposed to her. Starting from 1984, local newspapers began to feature news about the murders of young women in the Fort Worth area from time to time. Studying at the university at that time, McAdams perceived this threat extremely painfully. She seriously feared for her life, which she repeatedly told her loved one and relatives about. Terri took all possible measures to ensure her safety. For example, Terri quit her job in Irving, where she had to travel every day, returning home only late in the evening. Although it was a promising, high-paying position, Terri realized how dangerous such trips could be. McAdams left that job so as not to have to regularly travel by car at night. Despite her youth and energy, Terri began to lead a reclusive lifestyle. First of all, she did not leave the house after dark, did not attend any parties, and avoided strangers. Without her boyfriend's escort, Terri tried not to leave her home even during the day. Terri was even afraid to go to the store for groceries and called her mother in Little Rock several times a day to tell her about her fears. McAdams was truly alarmed by what was happening around her, as well as the fact that the authorities had not yet been able to identify and name the perpetrator, which meant that the streets were still unsafe. Around the same time, a task force was created, which included Texas investigators, experienced experts who were supposed to investigate the crimes and stop the series of bloody massacres. It was assumed that there was a serial killer or even several attackers at large. Terri was also trembling because she fit the type of victims that the criminal was looking for very well. They were all attractive girls about her age and lived in the area. McAdams could barely contain her fear, but her mother supported her in every way. The scariest thing was being alone, as Terri confessed to her mom and sisters. Even her boyfriend had to quit his job and find a new, well-paying one closer to home, although it required periodic business trips to neighboring cities. When the young man was away, McAdams panicked and tried to leave the house as little as possible. Immediately after classes, Terri would return home. And if there were any urgent matters, Terri tried to settle them in the morning hours, always looking for someone to go with. Fortunately, her boyfriend's business trips lasted no more than 1 or 2 days, so McAdams managed quite well. One evening in 1985, an alarming call came to the local police station. A worker who was in charge of the technical maintenance of the apartments in the residential complex where Terri lived reported that he could not get into one of the apartments. This could happen for various, completely innocent reasons and looked quite ordinary. But the man knew Terri well. This situation seemed uncharacteristic for the girl to him because they had agreed on an early visit by the repairman to carry out repair work. McAdams could not possibly miss this meeting. Until that moment, the repairman was not too concerned about Terri's excessive fears, but now he assumed that they might not have been groundless. Suddenly Terri was not afraid for nothing. When the police officers arrived at the scene, no one opened the door for them either. Attempts to contact McAdams' loved ones were unsuccessful, so the law enforcement officers decided to interview local residents. The neighbors confirmed the repairman's words. They also knocked on Terri's door, but to no avail, although they heard some suspicious noise in her apartment, after which they tried to find out what had happened. Despite this, no one reacted to the doorbell. Considering the statements and concerns of the neighbors, the law enforcement officers were forced to break down the door. The bloody scene that opened up to the officers' eyes inside the apartment shocked everyone. In the bedroom, right on the bed, they found the mutilated body of Terri. It seemed that she had been tortured for a long time. Terri was not only raped, but also brutally beaten with a blunt object. Judging by the condition of the body and the blood, the attack occurred at night or early in the morning before the police were called. Criminologists immediately arrived at the call and set to work at the crime scene. A fierce struggle had clearly taken place here. Terri's desperate resistance was eloquently evidenced by numerous defensive injuries on her arms and upper body. But the girl's face suffered the most. McAdams was subjected to a prolonged beating with bare hands and some kind of crushing weapon. There were traces of strangulation on the neck, but apparently the attacker did not kill her in this way. According to the forensic expert, death occurred as a result of a craniocerebral injury. The victim was also brutally raped, but whether it happened before or after the murder remained unknown. A lot of DNA traces were found on Terri's underwear and clothes, but it was not possible to establish their owners at that time. During that period, analysis methods were at an embryonic stage and could not be used in investigations. There were also no video surveillance cameras or geolocation tracking at that time. All this significantly complicated the solving of crimes. The version of robbery was quickly discarded because there were many valuable things left in the apartment, including in plain sight. Even if the perpetrator took something with him, his goal was clearly not to take possession of property. This was also evidenced by the degree of brutality of the massacre. In view of this, the investigators set about looking for suspects among the victim's inner circle, who could have a special motive, jealousy, hatred, or a thirst for revenge. But Terri seemed to have no enemies. McAdams was remarkably pleasant, benevolent, and non-confrontational. None of the relatives had any idea who could have wanted the student's death. During searches at the crime scene, which took place on February 14th, law enforcement officers failed to find the murder weapon. According to the criminologist's conclusion, it was a hammer or a similar metal tool. During the search of the apartment, a cigarette butt was found, although none of the residents smoked. Most likely, it belonged to the killer. Unfortunately, the technology of that time did not allow obtaining a DNA sample. The saliva remains were too meager, so this cigarette but could not provide much valuable information. However, the detectives at least found out the brand of cigarettes that the killer smoked. Of course, one of the priority versions considered was the involvement of a serial killer in the murder of McAdams, who was behind similar crimes in the area. The police compared the picture and method of the murder with other incidents that occurred in the vicinity. There could be a connection between them because the handwriting matched, although not completely. Considering the data collected during other investigations, the detectives assumed that perhaps the killer did not know his victims. The attacks occurred spontaneously. The perpetrator tried not to leave traces and not to attract the attention of neighbors, so he entered through the back sliding doors of the balcony and not through the front entrance. On the outer window frame, it was possible to find the imprint of the criminal's shoe sole. It is quite likely that he climbed a tree that grew a few meters from the wall of the apartment building. Unfortunately, apart from these meager facts, the detectives were not lucky enough to obtain any valuable information. A more detailed analysis was needed, including a forensic medical examination of the body. The investigators talked to the deceased's family, especially her mother and sisters, with whom Terri maintained the closest connection. They were all stunned by the tragedy. It seemed incredible that the cheerful McAdams could have enemies, and even so cruel that they would seek her death. It was also surprising that Terri seemed to have a premonition of her own death. Terri was wary of leaving the house, afraid of being attacked, and yet she was killed right in her own apartment. Rumors about what happened instantly spread throughout the city. The local community was convinced that there was a maniac operating here, capable of breaking into any home. Apparently, he was hunting for beautiful girls, stalking them, lying in wait, and attacking. People finally became convinced that no one could feel safe. Young women, especially, were at risk of becoming targets for new attacks. As befits Texans, they decided to take protection into their own hands. Over the next few months, sales of weapons and ammunition at military stores skyrocketed. The public began to put pressure on the police. The county sheriff appeared on a local TV channel with a call for all concerned citizens who might have even a shred of information about the criminal to respond. As soon as Terri's murder was covered in the local media, the police station was flooded with calls. But this did little to help advance the investigation. One of the main suspects in the early stages was McAdams' fiancée. But from the very beginning, this seemed absurd. The investigators were just trying to fit him into the picture of the crime, the psychological profile of the killer, in order to close the case faster and calm the public. But all attempts were in vain. No one from Terri's inner circle could believe that her fiancé was capable of such atrocities. As soon as his alibi about his business trip was confirmed, the young man was left alone. The young man was indeed out of town and was supposed to meet his beloved at the airport just when the police found her. In order to recreate the chronology of events on the eve of the tragedy, the detectives communicated with McAdams' loved ones. On the morning of February 13th, Terri went to school. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Terri left the university, got into her car, and headed home. There she changed her clothes and then drove out shopping, also in her own car. McAdams was alone, although she usually tried to take her friends with her, but that day everyone was busy. First of all, Terri visited the nearest grocery store. Terri needed ingredients for the cake that she was going to bake for her beloved the next day, on Valentine's Day. After all, her boyfriend was due to return from another business trip the next morning. However, the young man arrived home only a few hours later, when criminologists were already actively working at the crime scene. The supermarket salespeople confirmed that they saw Terri at the checkout. They provided a receipt with her purchases. There really were cake ingredients there. It was possible to find out that McAdams left the store around 6:30. Investigators interviewed everyone who could have crossed paths with Terri at that time, hoping that people might have noticed something suspicious, such as a stalker following Terri, or something similar. But no one noticed anything alarming. It looked like an ordinary grocery trip. Terri behaved calmly, paid for the goods, and just left. Apparently, no one was following the girl. McAdams returned home and did not go out anymore. A meeting with a repairman was planned for the morning, since she had problems with the electrical wiring. It was thanks to this man that the deceased was discovered. By an unfortunate coincidence, None of the neighbors next door were at home that evening and night. Those who heard the suspicious fuss lived further away and could not fully assess the scale of what was happening. Moreover, the sounds quickly died down and people calmed down. The degree of brutality of the crime could only indicate that the killer felt rage and hatred towards his victim. Certainly, in such cases, the criminal should be sought among the victim's inner circle. But in this situation, this approach did not work, because Terry's fiancée was far from the city. He was shocked by the tragedy. After all, in just a few months, Terry and Anister were planning to get married. The young man had already managed to give her an engagement ring worth $5,000. However, during the searches, the police were unable to find this ring. At first, this was considered a motive for the attack, a robbery that went wrong. But still, this version turned out to be far-fetched. After a more thorough analysis of the events, it became obvious that nothing else had disappeared. The attacker could have grabbed the jewelry just in passing. It seemed that the ring simply caught someone's eye. Apparently, the expensive piece of jewelry must have caught the eye of the criminal. So about 250 flyers with a photo of the engagement ring were sent to all local pawnshops, including in the nearest cities, Fort Worth and Dallas. All jewelry-related trade shops and organizations were notified. But no one reported the missing ring to the police. The investigators checked all possible leads. Despite this, none of them led to certain results. All the suspects who were interviewed provided alibis. Their testimonies were confirmed by the statements of other persons or documented. Law enforcement officers were also interested in criminals who had convictions for violent crimes and lived in the area. There were several suitable candidates who were at large at that time, but each of them managed to convince the police of their non-involvement. Gradually, the investigation began to reach a dead end. Terry's loved ones made desperate attempts to move the case forward. They repeatedly appealed to the public, in particular through the media, appeared on television and radio. Relatives printed and pasted countless flyers, but nothing helped. Eventually, the murder and rape of Terri McAdams was sent to gather dust on the shelf of the archive of unsolved cases. The girl's loved ones continued to fight for justice, but the police simply did not have the necessary materials and opportunities to move forward. The investigation was stalled for 36 years, until 2021. It was then that a group of specialists was finally formed, which included experienced detectives and criminologists. Their task was to take a fresh look at long-forgotten cases and evidence, taking into account modern technologies. The murder of Terri McAdams was also included in the list. The investigation had at its disposal innovative DNA research methods that allowed re-examination of old physical evidence. The criminal's biological material remained on the victim's underwear, as well as on the sheets. Terri fought back desperately, so particles of the attacker's skin were found under her nails. The cigarette was also taken out of the archives and sent for examination because the criminal's saliva could have remained on it. A comprehensive analysis made it possible to compile a profile of the likely attacker. But when it was compared with the Cody's database, which included registered criminals, no matches were found. Terry's loved ones hoped to finally get answers to the questions that had tormented them for decades. However, despite new inspiration, the case stalled again. For at least a few more years. Of course, active work on the investigation continued all this time, until they decided to try an innovative approach, the technology of genetic genealogy. This required the help of the FBI. Finally, having exhausted all possible options in August 2023, the police department contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Dallas. They requested assistance in the case of Terri McAdams. It was assumed that the DNA samples collected at the crime scene and on the victim's body would undergo genetic research to build the criminal's genealogical tree. This made it possible to go beyond the Cody's database, which only included people who had committed crimes. Genealogical research provided a great chance to find all relatives, at least the closest ones, who were related to the attacker. Based on this information, it was easier to calculate the criminal. This approach is considered much more effective, since there are databases where people provide their DNA materials voluntarily. At the time of the investigation, the database was so broad that the probability of finding a match was almost 100%. And it really worked. FBI agents pointed to the Sharp family. It was an ordinary American family, but Bernard stood out among them. The man was well known to the police back in the 80s. Bernard Sharp was 30 years old in the distant 80s. At the time the crime was committed, he was married. Interestingly, Bernard was acquainted with Terri and her fiancé, even quite closely, as a neighbor. The man was communicated with during the investigation that took place immediately after McAdams' murder. He willingly cooperated with the investigation, supported the victim's loved ones. Bernard provided an alibi that seemed not too reliable to the police. Despite this, during the check, the man's wife confirmed his alibi, which allowed him to avoid arrest. In the end, all suspicions were removed from Sharp and the fruitless investigation continued. However, Bernard's wife paid dearly for covering up for her husband. Late in the evening of July 3, 1985, a man called the local police station, identifying himself as the cousin of Sharp's wife. He stated that he had received a gunshot wound and needed help. It seemed that there was an armed intruder in the house who had attacked his wife's friend, and himself. When law enforcement officers arrived at the scene of the tragedy, it resembled a real massacre. According to the wounded witness who contacted the police, late in the evening he returned with his wife, her friend, and sister to their home. An armed criminal was already waiting for them here. He opened fire, instantly killing 2 women and wounding the cousin. The cousin of Bernard's wife survived. He was lucky to escape from the shooting scene and ran to a neighbor. The injury turned out to be minor. The man believed that he remained alive only because he was not the main target of the attacker. It seems that Sharp did not expect to see a man here, and the intrusion with a weapon could have been timed to coincide with another attack with the aim of rape. When the perpetrator realized that the plan had failed, he began to kill everyone indiscriminately. In addition to the 2 shot women, Bernard's wife's brother was found seriously wounded at the scene of the bloody tragedy, as well as Sharp himself. He had a gunshot wound to the head. It was not possible to detain and charge the man. He died on July 3, 1985, having provoked another bloody incident. It now became clear why the attacks on girls in the city stopped after this tragedy. The brother of the serial killer's wife managed to survive the injuries he received. After a long recovery, he fully regained consciousness, but never understood what caused the shooting. Bernard left no suicide notes. Perhaps the decision to voluntarily take his own life was spontaneous. During the investigation, no witnesses were found to whom Sharp had told about his plans, as well as about his involvement in the murder of Terri and other girls. But he hinted to several close friends that he knew McAdams' killer, but did not name names. It remained a mystery whether it was a desperate desire of the criminal to boast about his bloody adventures. Just a few months after Terri's murder, Bernard was found dead after he shot his wife, her friend, and seriously wounded his wife's brother. The police did not have Sharp's DNA samples. The place of his burial for exhumation of the body and examination could not be found. Then the police had to resort to extreme measures. To prove his involvement in the murder of Terri McAdams, officers were forced to travel outside the state to meet with one of his registered relatives. The man did not want his name to be associated with the murders, but agreed to provide his DNA sample. In the end, thanks to forensic genealogy, it was possible to prove Bernard's guilt. At the time of the criminal's death, the police did not have the opportunity to compare his DNA materials with samples from crime scenes. The investigators were unable to establish a connection between the previous attacks. This was probably due to the difference in the criminal's handwriting. Before the murder of his relatives, Bernard did not use firearms, but limited himself to brutal beatings and rapes. Perhaps, due to the heavy caseload at the time related to other crimes, it was not possible to bring him to justice. Since Sharp shot himself, his name and fingerprints did not end up in the police database. Therefore, there could be no matches in Cody's. Until his death, he lived near Terri McAdams. By the age of 30, the man already had a rich criminal history, which included repeated arrests for hooliganism and robberies, as well as sexual assaults. At least one case is known when Bernard lured 2 girls into his house under false pretenses, and then beat them, tied them up, and raped them, including with the use of torture. The girls miraculously managed to survive this attack and escape. They turned to the police, and Sharp was detained. The man was even able to be charged, but thanks to the skillful work of a lawyer, the sentence was short. He never stopped, and every time after being released, he again became a person involved in various criminal episodes. In the end, all this led to the death of Terri. Given the nature of the criminal's attacks, the police assumed that he could be involved in other crimes committed in the area where he lived. A suitable candidate for the role of a rapist and serial killer appeared, who could help solve several more atrocities committed in that area and so frighten Terri during her lifetime. The DNA profile of the probable criminal was transferred to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was also entered into the database of persons known in criminal circles. However, there is still no confirmed information regarding Sharp's involvement in other crimes. The investigation is still ongoing. For the family of the murdered Terri, establishing the identity of the criminal was a huge relief. Despite the fact that they were unable to achieve justice and will not see how McAdams' killer goes to prison for the rest of his days, or even be sentenced to capital punishment, they felt satisfaction from the closure of the case. After 39 years, the murder investigation was finally deservedly completed. This was made possible thanks to the latest technology. The victim's sisters appeared on a local TV channel and gave several interviews to journalists to talk about their feelings after the murder was solved almost 40 years later. They believed that it would have been much better to see the triumph of justice with their own eyes, but they remained satisfied with the fact that the dangerous killer himself stopped a series of atrocities many years ago and could no longer harm anyone. If Bernard had not done this, then over the next decades, many other innocent women could have become his victims. The story of Terri McAdams is a tragic tale of a young life cut short by a cruel and senseless death. She became a victim of a criminal who terrorized the local community for years, sowing fear and despair. Bernard Sharp, a man with a rich criminal history, destroyed not only Terri's life but also the happiness of her family and friends. He deprived the world of a bright, kind, and caring girl who had so many opportunities and plans ahead of her. This case clearly demonstrates how important the persistence, dedication, and professionalism of investigators are. Despite the fact that it took decades to solve this crime, law enforcement officers did not give up and tirelessly searched for the truth. Thanks to modern technologies, in particular innovative DNA research methods, it was finally possible to establish the identity of the killer and prove his guilt. And although Bernard Sharp escaped earthly justice by committing suicide, Terri's relatives at least received answers to their painful questions. This story reminds us that evil can lurk very close, behind familiar faces and everyday masks. It encourages us to be vigilant, to take care of the safety of our loved ones, and not to remain indifferent to the misfortunes of others. The memory of Terri McAdams will forever remain in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. And although the girl cannot be returned, at least the truth is now known, and justice, even if late, has triumphed. If you are interested in this story and want to learn more about the investigation of intricate crimes, I invite you to subscribe to my channel's Detective Brooks. Here you will find many exciting stories about high-profile criminal cases, the secrets of investigators, and interesting details from the lives of law enforcement officers. Support the channel with your subscription, and together we will immerse ourselves in the world of investigations, the search for truth, and the fight for justice. See you soon.